And so I would like to quote for you the summary of this issue by William Chillingworth. And when he refers to the early premillennial faith, keep in mind, these were futurist premillennialists exclusively that he's describing, okay? But look at what he says. Part 5. An argument drawn from the doctrine of the millenaries against infallibility. The doctrine of the millenaries was that before the world's end, Christ should reign upon earth for 1,000 years, and that the saints should live under him in all holiness and happiness. That this doctrine is, by the present Roman Church, held false and heretical, I think no man will deny. That the same doctrine was, by the Church of the next age after the Apostles, held true and Catholic, I prove by these 2 reasons. The first reason: whatsoever doctrine is believed and taught by the most eminent fathers of any age of the Church, and by none of their contemporaries opposed or condemned, that is to be esteemed the Catholic doctrine of the Church of those times. But the doctrine of the millenaries was believed and taught by the most eminent fathers of the age next after the Apostles, and by none of that age opposed or condemned. Therefore, it was the Catholic doctrine of the Church of those times. The proposition of this syllogism is Cardinal Perrin's rule, and is indeed one of the main pillars upon which the great fabric of his answer to King James doth stand, and with which it cannot but fall, and therefore I will spend no time in the proof of it, but the assumption thus I prove. That doctrine, which was believed and taught by Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis, the disciple of the Apostles' disciples, according to Eusebius, who lived in the times of the Apostles, saith he, by Justin Martyr, doctor of the Church and martyr, by Melito, Bishop of Sardis, who had the gift of prophecy, witness Tertullian, and who Bellarmine acknowledges a saint, by Saint Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, and martyr, and was not opposed or condemned by any one doctor of the Church of those times. That doctrine was believed and taught by the most eminent fathers of that age next to the Apostles, and opposed by none. But the former part of the proposition is true, ergo, the latter is true also. The major of this syllogism and the latter part of the minor, I suppose, will need no proof with them that consider that these here mentioned were equal in number to all the other ecclesiastical writers of that age, of whom there is any memory remaining, and in weight and worth infinitely beyond them. They were Athenagoras, Theophilus Antiochus, Agesippus, and Hippolytus, of whose contradiction to this doctrine there is not extant, either in their works or in story, any print or footstep, which if they or any of them had opposed, it had not been impossible, considering the ecclesiastical story of their time is written by the professed enemies of the millenaries' doctrine, who, could they have found anything in the monuments of antiquity to have put in the balance against Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, no doubt would not have buried it in silence, which yet they do, neither vouching for their opinion any one of more antiquity than Dionysius Alexandrinus, who lived with Eusebius in our age, but certainly in the latter part of the 3rd century. For Tatianus, because a heretic, I reckon not in this number, and if any man say that before his fall he wrote many books, I say it is true, but withal would have it remembered that he was Justin Martyr's scholar, and therefore in all probability of his master's faith, rather than against it. All that is extant of him one way or other is but this in St. Jerome's On Ecclesiastical Writers, he was a follower of Justin Martyr. Now, for the other part of the minor, that the forementioned fathers did believe and teach this doctrine. And first, for Papias, that he taught it, is confessed by Eusebius, the enemy of this doctrine, in Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 33, in these words, quote, "Other things beside the same author, Papias, declares that they came to him as it were by unwritten tradition, wherein he affirms that after the resurrection of all flesh from the dead, there shall be a kingdom of Christ continued and established for 1,000 years upon earth, after a human and corporeal manner." The same is confessed by St. Jerome, another enemy to this opinion, on Ecclesiastical Writers, section 29. Quote, "Papias, the auditor of John, bishop of Hierapolis, is said to have taught the Judaical tradition of 1,000 years, whom Irenaeus and Apollinarius followed," unquote. And in his preface upon the commentaries of Victorinus upon the Apocalypse, thus he writes, "Before him Papias, bishop of Hierapolis, and Nepos, bishop in the parts of Egypt, taught as Victorinus does, touching the kingdom of the 1,000 years." Unquote. The same is testified by Irenaeus, Against Heresies, Book 5, Chapter 33, where, having at large set forth this doctrine, he confirms it by the authority of Papias in these words, quote, "Papias also, the auditor of John, the familiar friend of Polycarpus, an ancient man, hath testified by writing these things in the fourth of his books, for he hath written 5, unquote. And concerning Papias thus much. That Justin Martyr was of the same belief is confessed by Sixtus Senensis, by Favor Dentius, in his premonition before the last 5 chapters of the 5th book of Irenaeus, and by Premillennialism in his published works of Tertullian, with annotations. That Saint Melito, bishop of Sardis, held the same doctrine is confessed by Premillennialism in the same place, and thereupon it is that Gennadius Musiliensis, in his book, calls the followers of this opinion Melitani, as the same Premillennialism testifies in his notes upon that fragment of Tertullian, on the hope of believers. Irenaeus's faith in this point is likewise confessed by Eusebius in the place before quoted, in these words, quote, "Papias was the author of the like error to most of the writers of the Church, who allege the antiquity of the man for a defense of their side, as to Irenaeus, and whosoever else seem to be of the same opinion with him." By St. Jerome, in the place above cited, on Ecclesiastical Writers, section 29, again in his commentary on Ezekiel 11, in these words, quote, "For neither do we expect from heaven a golden Jerusalem, according to the Jewish tales, which they call deuterosis, which also many of our own have followed," unquote. Especially Tertullian, in his book On the Hope of Believers, and Lactantius, in his 7th book of Institutions, and the frequent expositions of Victorinus Pictacvionensis, and of late Severius, in his dialogue, which he calls Gallus, and to name the Greeks and to join together the first and last, Irenaeus and Paulinarius," unquote, where we see he acknowledges Irenaeus to be of this opinion, but that he was the first that held it. I believe that that is more a Christian untruth than Irenaeus's opinion a Judaical fable, for he himself acknowledges in the place above cited that Irenaeus followed Papias, and it is certain and confessed that Justin Martyr believed it long before him. And Irenaeus himself derives it from the presbyters who sold John, the disciple of the Lord. From priests which sold John, the disciple of the Lord. Lastly, by Premillennialism, Sixtus Sinensis, and Favordentius in the places above quoted. Seeing, therefore, it is certain, even to the confession of the adversaries, that Papias, Justin Martyr, Melito, and Irenaeus, the most considerable and eminent men of their age, did believe and teach this doctrine. And, seeing it has been proved as evidently as a thing of this nature can be, that none of their contemporaries opposed or condemned it, it remains, according to Cardinal Perrin's first rule, that this is to be esteemed the doctrine of the Church of that age. My second reason I formed thus: whatsoever doctrine is taught by the fathers of any age, not as doctors, but as witnesses of the tradition of the Church, that is, not as their own opinion, but as the doctrine of the Church of their times, that is undoubtedly to be so esteemed, especially if none contradicted them in it. But the fathers above cited teach this doctrine, not as their own private opinion, but as the Christian tradition, and as the doctrine of the Church, neither did any contradict them in it. Ergo, it is undoubtedly to be so esteemed. The major of this syllogism is Cardinal Perrin's second rule and way of finding out the doctrine of the ancient Church in any age, and if it be not a sure rule, farewell the use of all antiquity. And for this minor, there will be little doubt of it to him that considers that Papias professes himself to have received this doctrine by unwritten tradition, though not from the apostles themselves immediately, yet from their scholars, as appears by Eusebius in the forecited third book, chapter 33. That Irenaeus grounded it upon evident scripture, and professes that he learned it, whether mediately or immediately, I cannot tell, from presbyters, priests who saw John, the disciple of the Lord. Priests or elders who saw John, the Lord's disciple, and heard of him what our Lord taught of those times, of the 1,000 years, and also, as he says after, from Papias, the auditor of John, the chamber fellow of Polycarpus, an ancient man, who recorded it in writing. Favordentius's note upon this place is very notable. Hence it is clear, saith he, and etc. From hence it appears that Irenaeus neither first invented this opinion, nor held it as proper to himself, but got this blot and blemish from certain fathers. Papias, I suppose, and some other inglorious fellows, the familiar friends of Irenaeus, are here intended. I hope, then, if the fathers which lived with the apostles had their blots and blemishes, it is no such horrid crime for Calvin and the century writers to impute the same to their great-grandchildren. The generation of our parents was worse than our grandparents, and generations are progressively worse and worse. But yet these inglorious disciples of the apostles, though perhaps not so learned as Favordentius, were yet certainly so honest as not to invent lies and deliver them as apostolic tradition. Or, if they were not, what confidence can we place in any other unwritten tradition? Lastly, that Justin Martyr grounds it upon plain prophecies of the Old Testament and express words of the New. He professeth that he and all other Christians of a right belief in all things believe it, joins them who believe it not with them who deny the resurrection, or else says that none denied this but the same who denied the resurrection, and that indeed they were called Christians, but in deed and in truth were none. Whosoever, I say, considers these things will easily grant that they held it not as their own opinion, but as the doctrine of the Church and the faith of Christians. Hereupon I conclude, whatsoever they held, not as their private opinion, but as the faith of the Church, that was the faith of the Church of their time. But this doctrine they held, not as their private opinion, but as the faith of the Church. Ergo, it was and is to be esteemed the faith of the Church. Trypho. Do you confess that before you expect the coming of Christ, this place Jerusalem shall be again restored, and that your people shall be congregated and rejoice together with Christ and the patriarchs and the prophets, and etc.? Justin Martyr. I have confessed to you before that both I and many others do believe, as you well know, that this shall be, but that many again, who are not of the pure and holy opinion of Christians, do not acknowledge this. I have also signified unto you. For I have declared unto you that some called Christians, but being indeed atheists and impious heretics, do generally teach blasphemous and atheistical and foolish things. But that you might know that I speak not this to you only, I will make a book, as near as I can, of these our disputations, where I will profess in writing that which I say before you. For I resolve to follow not men and the doctrines of men, but God and the doctrine of God. For although you chance to meet with some that are called Christians, which do not confess this, but dare to blaspheme the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, which also say there is no resurrection of the dead, but that as soon as they die, their souls are received into heaven, do not you yet think them Christians? As neither, if a man consider rightly, will he account the Sadducees and other sectaries and heretics as the Genistei and the Maristei, and Galileans and Pharisees and Hellenians and Baptists and others such to be Jews, but only that they are called Jews and the children of Abraham, and such as with their lips confess God, as God himself cries out, but have their hearts far from him. But I and all Christians that in all things believe aright, both know that there shall be a resurrection of the flesh, and 1,000 years in Jerusalem restored and adorned and enlarged, according as the prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah and others do testify. For thus saith Isaiah of the time of this 1,000 years, For there shall be a new heaven and a new earth, and they shall not remember the former, and etc. And after, Justin Martyr goes on to say this in chapter 80. A certain man amongst us, whose name was John, one of the 12 apostles of Christ, in that revelation which was exhibited unto him, hath foretold that they which believe our Christ shall live in Jerusalem 1,000 years, and that after, the universal and everlasting resurrection and judgment shall be. I have presumed in the beginning of Justin Martyr's answer to substitute not instead of also, because I am confident that either by chance, or the fraud of some ill-willers to the millenary's opinion, the place has been corrupted, and quote not turned into quote also. For if we retain the usual reading, but that many who are also of the pure and holy opinion of Christians do not acknowledge this, I have also signified unto you, then we must conclude that Justin Martyr himself did believe the opinion of them which denied the 1,000 years to be the pure and holy opinion of Christians. And, if so, why did he not himself believe it? Nay, how could he but believe it to be true, professing it, as he does, if the place be right, to be the pure and holy opinion of Christians? For how a false doctrine can be the pure and holy opinion of Christians, what Christian can conceive? Or, if it may be so, how can the contrary avoid being untrue, unholy, and not the opinion of Christians? Again, if we read the place thus, quote, that many who are also of the pure and holy opinion of Christians do not acknowledge this, I have also signified, unquote. Certainly there will be neither sense nor reason, neither coherence nor consequence in the words following, quote, for I have told you of many called Christians, but being indeed atheists and heretics, that they altogether teach blasphemous and impious and foolish things. For how is this a confirmation or reason of, or any way pertinent unto, what went before? If there he speak of none but such as were of the pure and holy opinion of Christians. And therefore, to disguise this inconsequence, the translators thought fit to make use of a false translation, and instead of, quote, for I have told you, unquote, to make it, quote, besides, I have told you of many, and etc. Again, if Justin Martyr had thought this the pure and holy opinion of Christians, or them good and holy Christians that held it, why does he rank them with them that denied the resurrection? Why does he say afterward, although you chance to meet with some that are called Christians, which do not confess this, do not ye think them Christians? Lastly, what sense is there in saying, as he does, I and all Christians that are of a right belief in all things believe the doctrine of the 1,000 years, and that the Scriptures, both of the Old and New Testament, teach it, and yet say that many of the pure and holy opinion of Christians do not believe it? Upon these reasons, I suppose it is evident that the place has been corrupted, and it is to be corrected according as I have corrected it, by substituting not in the place of also. Neither need any man think it strange that this misfortune of the change of a syllable should befall this place, who considers that in this place Justin Martyr tells us that he had said the same things before, whereas nothing to this purpose appears now in him, and that in Victorinus's comment on the Revelations, wherein by St. Jerome's acknowledgment this doctrine was strongly maintained, there now appears nothing at all for it, but rather against it. And now from this place thus restored, these observations offer themselves unto us. 1. That Justin Martyr speaks not as a doctor, but as a witness of the doctrine of the Church of his time. I, saith he, and all Christians that are of a right belief in all things, hold this, and therefore from hence, according to Cardinal Perrin's rule, we are to conclude, not probably, but demonstratively, that this was the doctrine of the Church of that time. 2. That they held it as a necessary matter, so far as to hold them no Christians that held the contrary. Though you chance to meet with some called Christians that do not confess this, but dare to blaspheme the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and etc., yet do not ye think them Christians. Now, if Bellarmine's rule be true, that councils then determine any things as matters of faith when they pronounce them heretics that hold the contrary. Sure then Justin Martyr held this doctrine as a matter of faith, seeing he pronounceth them no Christians that contradict it. 3. That the doctrine is grounded upon the Scripture of the Old and New Testament and the revelation of St. John, and that by a doctor and martyr of the Church, and such an one as was converted to Christianity within 30 years after the death of St. John, when in all probability there were many alive that had heard him expound his own words and teach this doctrine. And if probabilities will not be admitted, this is certain out of the most authentical records of the Church, that Papias, the disciple of the apostles' disciples, taught at the Church, professing that he had received it from them that learned it from the apostles. And if, after all this, the church of those times might err in a doctrine so clearly derived and authentically delivered, how, without extreme impudence, can any church in after times pretend to infallibility? The millenaries' doctrine was overborne by imputing to them that which they held not, by abrogating the authority of St. John's revelation, as some did, or by derogating from it, as others, ascribing it not to St. John the Apostle, but to some other John, they knew not who, which Dionysius, the first known adversary of this doctrine, and his followers, against the tradition of Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and all the fathers their antecessors, by calling it a Judaical opinion, and yet allowing it as probable, by corrupting the authors for it, as Justin, Victorinus Severus.